So the first premises that Milburn defends against is dignity. So those who are in favor of companions eating a meat-based diet basically argue that feeding your cats and dogs a vegan-based diet is stripping them of the little dignity they have left, and a vegan-based diet wouldn't give them any dignity. So first, Milburn starts out by addressing what it means to have dignity, especially for non-human animals. So he kind of just dives in and starts with one philosopher's opinion on it, who is Elizabeth Anderson. And she basically just says that the dignity of any animal really just depends on how they relate to humans and how they are decent to human society and what they can contribute. So then Milburn introduces an opposing view from Gruen. And Gruen basically says that making non human animals decent for society, which is exactly what Anderson said makes them dignified, is, and then Gruen says that is basically what it means for these animals to be undignified. So Gruen's argument is making animals decent for human society just gives them absolutely no dignity. Gruen then goes on to say that dignity for these animals, which she calls wild dignity, is how we just as humans respect their lives and how they would act naturally in their normal behaviors. That is their wild dignity, and that is how dignity should be defined. So then Milburn goes on to basically argue against both of these. So he says that Anderson's argument isn't really valid because if you would feed your non-human animal a vegan-based diet, they're still going to be decent for human society. It's not impacting human relation or making a difference in any kind of way. So therefore, there really is no argument against vegan diets in Anderson's opinion. Then he moves on to Gruen and claims that the extent of what she calls wild dignity is really unclear. So since animals like cats and dogs have been under human care for such a long time, we can't really call them wild creatures anymore. They've kind of evolved into house animals since they've been in human control. So he claims that this wild dignity really can't be defined because these animals aren't wild creatures anymore. So then Milburn moves on to analyze another concept of dignity, which is Michael Myers' account. So Myers argues that all sentient beings have simple dignity. Milburn says this really isn't right because simple dignity is more about moral standing and doesn't really apply to the opposition of vegan diets, because vegan diet surrounds the idea that we should be giving particular treatments of this type of food versus another, and that really has no correlation to moral standing, so Milburn deems this one incorrect. So after these three arguments, Milburn basically squashes all these theories and says that they really have no clear opposition to vegan diets. Yes, you could dig a little deeper into these theories and kind of make arguments against it, but they really have no ties to carnivorous diets and in favor of them or opposing vegan diets. So then, moving forward, Milburn then looks at Nussbaum's account of her species-based approach to dignity. So Nussbaum's argument is a little complicated. So first she starts out by saying that the capabilities non-human animals have defines their dignity. So she claims these capabilities are having a nutritious diet, getting physical activity, having some freedom. Those are what she says are capabilities. So then Milburn goes in to kind of bring some examples of what these capabilities are, and especially because Nussbaum's argument is that capabilities are species related. So Milburn starts by saying that if a dog is from the species called Canis lupus, which is the same species wolves are in, then they do have a flesh-eating capability. It's in their blood. On the other hand, if dogs are members of the C. familiaris, which is a species based on how dogs have been raised by humans over a long period of time, then they don't have that capability of eating meat. So just because they can eat meat does not mean that veganism is undignified for these animals. So this is kind of where the big argument comes in, where Nussbaum explains that all capabilities that these animals have aren't good. Just because they have these capabilities doesn't mean that it's really okay. So she goes in to be a little more specific and says that all these capabilities that animals have should be, first they should be evaluated, then they kind of should be sorted into which are the good ones and which ones are the bad, and then which capabilities are required to kind of live a bare minimum life. Then she goes on to say, and she gets a little radical by saying that the bad capabilities that these species or these animals from these species have should just be banished. They should not be in practice. People should not be promoting these kinds of things. So Milburn then kind of interjects his opinion here and says that just because it's natural and just because these animals have this capability does not mean that it should be promoted. So this is when it comes in that a vegan-based diet wouldn't harm these animals in any kind of way. Just because they can do this doesn't mean that they should. And Milburn claims that he has clearly shown earlier in his paper that eating meat, that companions eating meat is bad. So he basically says that just because they can eat this flesh doesn't mean they should. Therefore, the idea shouldn't be promoted. So he's emphasizing how Nussbaum's argument is directly enforces his idea about veganism. So these animals, just because they're able to, doesn't mean they should. So lastly, Milburn proceeds to actually question the validity of dignity in the argument. So he takes into consideration that non-human animal dignity is actually controversial, because as we've seen throughout this section of his paper, there's a bunch of different kinds of arguments about the topic. So there's a lot of kind of different interpretations and ideas, and there's really no truth. No one knows the truth or the extent of this kind of argument. So he claims that further and legitimate exploration of non-human animal dignity is basically impossible. So he even goes on to quote Peter Singer, who says, "Philosophers frequently introduce the ideas of dignity at the point which other reasons appear to be lacking, but this is hardly good enough." So Milburn's basically saying that using dignity in an argument is kind of like using it as a last resort. It can't really ground an argument and doesn't really have enough factual, or not factual, but doesn't really have enough evidence behind it to really ground a good argument. So he's saying that dignity really can't be used in the opposition of vegan diets.